All right, second half of chapter 3, focusing mostly on 3.4, what happens to matter in an ecosystem. It's going to be, as we talk about these different cycles, lots of references to reservoirs. So these are storage sites of nutrients, ocean, other sites of water, the atmosphere, and then underground and in rocks. Those are some of our primary reservoirs. All right, water cycle. You've been studying this for a very long time. Know this diagram. Understand the different activities that are happening here in the processes. It's definitely the simplest cycle to learn, mostly due to familiarity, but it's very important. When we're looking at the water cycle, keep in mind that water flowing above and below ground plus evaporation and transpiration leads to purification, which is very important because the water that's here on Earth is the water it's all the water we have. It's the water that's been here for millennia. We are impacting the water cycle as we get into here. So some of the major human impacts on the water are the hydrologic cycle. First is over-withdrawal from aquifers, lakes, and streams. We've talked about that in terms of why are there water bans during droughts in town because of withdrawing from the watershed that the Ipswich River is part of. Increased runoff, think about flooding, right? Increased flooding, and then water pollution. So we'll talk about all of these things in more detail again when we get into the water resources and water pollution in the spring. Carbon cycle, and that's probably the one you're most familiar with after water. Definitely note this diagram right here, figure 319. Notice that all of the human impacts, those red arrows, increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're at 0.04% or 400 parts per million. We're over that now as a standard. Human impacts on the carbon cycle, burning of fossil fuels, it's huge, or combustion, deforestation, transportation, and forest fires. These will all come up again multiple times, particularly when we get to our energy unit and then climate change. The nitrogen cycle is the most complicated to learn and understand. So, got this diagram here, know this diagram. When in doubt, you remember bacteria. Okay. One important thing to understand about the nitrogen cycle is that 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, N2, but we can't use it in that form. Plants can't, animals can't, etc. So that's why we rely on bacteria. This right here, write it down, FIXNAD and PAN. Okay. This is a kind of clunky way to remember processes and products. So the FIXNAD, the processes are fixation, nitrification, assimilation, ammonification, and denitrification. The ANPAN helps us remember the products: ammonia, nitrates, proteins, ammonia and ammonium, and nitrogen gas. So nitrogen fixation produces ammonia, takes nitrogen gas and turns it into ammonia. Nitrification produces nitrates. Okay? Assimilation, when you assimilate, make part of, that's the formation of proteins in tissues. Ammonification makes ammonia and ammonium, and then denitrification is the opposite of fixation. Basically, it's producing nitrogen gas. Human impacts on the nitrogen cycle: fuel combustion, fertilizer use, land destruction, agricultural runoff, and the removal of crops. And then phosphorus cycle, okay, know this diagram over here. This cycle is different because there is no atmospheric phase, so it's a very slow cycle compared to the other ones. Because of that, phosphorus is often a limiting factor for plant growth. If you think about fertilizers, they usually contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In terms of the phosphorus cycle, how are humans impacting it? We are increasing phosphorus runoff into the water from agriculture and fertilizer use, sewage, and mining. This can lead to something called cultural eutrophication, which we will be talking about shortly. And then your final cycle, and this one's probably new to you, is the sulfur cycle. You probably don't need to know this diagram super well in terms of the processes as much, but you definitely need to know how humans are impacting the sulfur cycle. So coal burning releases sulfur, refining fossil fuels, and then mining and smelting. Sulfur comes out most often when talking about an increase in sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere through things like coal burning and fossil fuel refinery, and that can increase acid deposition. Okay. The last part of chapter 3, how do scientists study ecosystems? It's good to read, skim through, but there's nothing in here that I think is make or break. And this, using Google Earth, this is pretty cool, and we'll look at some Google Earth stuff later on. That's it for chapter 3.